The bailiff kicked the front door open, shattering the lock and forcing Serafina onto her knees in the freezing mud. She clutched her swollen stomach, feeling the icy rain soak into her thin nightgown as the creditors began tossing her few remaining chairs into the dirt. If she is evicted tonight, her child will be born on the roadside and likely die before dawn. Her reputation is already ashes, but now her very survival, and the life of the only person she has left, is being auctioned off to the highest bidder. The lead creditor stepped over her, grinding his boot into the hem of her white dress with a sneer of absolute triumph. He knew she had no family left to call upon and no coin to beg with. "Give up the locket and crawl into the woods, widow," he laughed, "because in this kingdom, even the dirt you're sitting on belongs to the crown now." A thundering rhythm of hooves drowned out his laughter as a massive, black and gold carriage slammed to a halt, splashing mud over the creditors' fine coats. The door swung open before the drivers could even dismount, and King Lucian Montrevel stepped directly into the filth, ignoring every man present to shield Serafina with his own heavy, fur-lined cloak. He didn't look at the debt collectors. He simply drew his sword and drove the point into the mud inches from the lead creditor's foot, claiming the ground as royal soil. But as Lucian lifted the traitor's wife into his arms, the creditors exchanged a look of panicked malice. The king has just declared protection over a woman his own laws demand must be executed. By saving her life, has Lucian just handed his enemies the one weapon they need to take his throne? The heavy iron gates groaned as they buckled under the weight of the king's massive carriage. The wood of the royal wheels splintered against the stone pillars, the sound echoing through the valley like a gunshot. A heavy, suffocating silence followed, broken only by the rhythmic hiss of the torrential rain against the mud. The creditors froze, their hands still gripping the stolen furniture, their faces drained of color as they recognized the black and gold filigree of the royal house. Serafina did not feel saved. She felt a new, sharper kind of terror. She remained on her knees in the filth, her hands trembling against her stomach, watching the carriage door swing open. King Lucian Montrevel stepped out into the storm, his eyes scanning the scene with the cold precision of a predator. He did not look at the bailiffs or the broken furniture. His gaze locked onto Serafina, who looked like a ghost in her soaked, white nightgown. The creditors scrambled backward, some tripping over the very chairs they had just looted from the manor. No one dared to breathe as the king's heavy boots crunched through the gravel, each step bringing the weight of the crown closer to the woman he had personally exiled. Inside Serafina's mind, the world was spinning into a dark, familiar void. She wasn't thinking of the warmth of the king's cloak. She was thinking of the day he signed the decree that turned her into a pariah. Every drop of rain felt like a needle against her skin, a reminder that her identity as a noblewoman was long dead. She was no longer Serafina Vale, the Duchess's daughter. She was the traitor's widow, a title Lucian himself had branded onto her soul. She tightened her grip on her belly, terrified that his presence was not a coincidence, but a final, cruel sentence. If he found her here, in this state, would he take the child to ensure the traitor's blood never rose again? Trust was a luxury she had buried alongside her husband's empty casket. Every time a powerful man had looked at her with kindness in the last year, it had been a prelude to a demand for her body or her remaining secrets. The fear of what Lucian would do once he realized she was in labor was a physical weight, pressing down on her lungs until she could barely gasp for air. She looked at the king and saw not a savior, but the man who had the power to make her disappear forever. The lead creditor, a man named Sealers, finally found his voice, though it cracked with a desperate, oily fear. "Your Majesty, this woman is a debtor to the crown. We were only enforcing the law you yourself established." Lucian didn't even turn his head toward the man, his silhouette standing rigid against the lightning-streaked sky. "The law does not mandate the murder of an unborn child in the mud, Sealers," the king replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Sealers bristled, his greed momentarily overcoming his common sense as he gestured to the manor behind them. "She has no claim to this land. Your own advisors ordered the seizure to pay for her husband's crimes against your throne. Lucian's hand moved to the hilt of his sword, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a wave of panic through the guards standing nearby. My advisors do not command the weather, nor do they command me when I am standing on my own soil. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke, a silent war of wills between a desperate bureaucrat and a monarch who looked ready to burn the world down. Lucian's eyes never left Seraphina's pale face, tracking the way she winced as another contraction rippled through her body. If you interfere with the crown's collection, there will be questions in the capital, Silas stammered, his eyes darting to the king's guards. Lucian simply stepped closer to Seraphina, his shadow falling over her like a dark wing, refusing to acknowledge the threat. The king's decision to shield Seraphina was not merely a gesture of mercy, it was a spark thrown into a powder keg of political alliances. By touching the traitor's widow, Lucian was effectively spitting in the faces of the council members who had engineered her husband's fall. Every man present knew that the king's authority rested on a fragile peace with the High Lords who hated the House of Vale. If news reached the capital that the king had spent the night in the bedchamber of an exile, the whispers of treason would shift from her to him. The cost of this single act of protection was the stability of the entire kingdom. Alliances that had taken decades to forge would snap like dry twigs the moment the sun rose over the manor. Lucian was not just risking his reputation, he was risking a civil war for a woman who had every reason to wish him dead. The rain continued to wash away the mud, but it could not wash away the blood that would inevitably be spilled because of this choice. Seraphina felt the king's hand under her elbow, a grip of iron that forced her to stand, though her legs felt like water. "You are coming inside," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for the refusal she so desperately wanted to scream. As they crossed the threshold of the crumbling manor, Silas stepped forward one last time, his voice high and shrill against the wind. "Enjoy your guest, Majesty. But remember, the council expects a corpse by morning, not a queen." Lucian slammed the heavy oak door shut, the sound booming through the empty, cold halls of Blackwood Manor. Outside, the creditors began to mount their horses, their eyes glinting with the knowledge of the scandal they were about to deliver to the king's enemies. Seraphina collapsed against the damp wall, her breath coming in ragged hitches as a fresh wave of pain doubled her over. She looked up at Lucian, her eyes wide with a new, horrifying realization as she saw the blood on his gold-trimmed sleeve. "The carriage, it didn't just break," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They were trying to kill you before you ever reached my door." Lucian didn't deny it. He only looked at the dark hallway behind them, where the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. The king was trapped in a rotting house with a woman in labor, and the men who had broken his carriage were likely already surrounding the manor. The heavy oak door thudded shut, sealing out the roar of the storm, but trapping a far more volatile energy within the stone walls. In the sudden, oppressive silence of the foyer, the only sound was the wet slap of rainwater dripping from King Lucian's fur-lined cloak onto the cracked marble floor. Seraphina remained slumped against the wall, her chest heaving as she gripped a banister that groaned under her weight. The king's guards stood like iron statues by the door, their eyes averted, yet their presence felt like a firing squad. Lucian did not move to help her up immediately. Instead, he stood motionless, his eyes traveling over the ruin of the entrance hall. He saw the mold creeping up the tapestries and the way the grand chandelier hung by a single, rusted chain. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical weight on Seraphina's lungs. She saw the king's nostrils flare as he took in the scent of damp rot and cheap tallow candles. To Lucian, she was no longer the vibrant woman who had once graced the capital's ballrooms in silk and pearls. She was a broken thing, a smudge of white fabric against a backdrop of decay, her hands stained with the very mud he had just walked through. Seraphina watched his gaze linger on her bare, swollen ankles, and a fresh wave of humiliation burned hotter than the labor pains. She felt exposed, not just by her nightgown, but by the utter collapse of her dignity in the presence of the man who had ordered it. Inside her mind, Serafina was screaming for him to leave, to let the creditors take her rather than endure this scrutiny. She was no longer a person in his eyes. She was a political error, a widow of a traitor whose very existence was an insult to his throne. If he showed her mercy now, she knew it would come with a price tag she couldn't afford to pay. Every kindness from a crown was a debt, and she had already lost her home, her husband, and her name to his justice. She distrusted the way he looked at her, not with the cruelty of the bailiffs, but with a terrifying, clinical realization. He wasn't seeing a woman in need. He was seeing the physical evidence of his own administrative coldness. The consequences of him being here were already spiraling out of control in her head. If the king stayed to witness the birth of a traitor's child, the scandal would ensure her son never had a moment of peace. She felt like a specimen under glass, a fallen noblewoman serving as a mirror to a king's mistakes. The thought of him touching her again made her skin crawl with the fear of being managed like a piece of state property. She forced herself to breathe, trying to hide the twitch of her stomach as another contraction began to build. She would rather birth this child on the cold stone floor than accept a hand that had signed a death warrant for her family. Lucian finally turned his head, his voice cutting through the gloom like a blade. "Is this how the ghost of Blackwood has been living, while my counsel reported that you were well provided for?" Silas, the lead creditor who had dared to follow them to the threshold, hovered in the doorway, his face twisted in a mask of calculated defiance. "She was provided with what a traitor deserves, Majesty," Silas spat, his voice trembling but his eyes narrowed. The king stepped toward the man, his movements fluid and predatory. "I did not ask for your interpretation of the law, moneylender. I asked why a noblewoman is shivering in a house with no heat." Silas didn't flinch this time. He held up a roll of parchment bearing the seal of the High Chancellor. The council decided that the Vale estate was to be stripped to the bone to pay for the naval losses your cousin caused. The threat was unspoken but deafening. The king was being reminded that he was not the only power in the kingdom. Lucian's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek as he realized his own advisors had been operating behind his back. "The council is not here tonight," Lucian whispered, his voice vibrating with a lethal calm that made the guards shift their weight. "I am, and I say this house is under the king's peace until the sun rises." Silas sneered, backing away into the rain, but hurling a final, jagged warning. "Then you will explain to the lords of the north why you chose a widow's comfort over their loyalty, Lucian." The king did not break his stare until the man disappeared into the darkness, but the victory felt hollow. He turned back to Serafina, the anger in his eyes shifting into something more complex and infinitely more dangerous. The cost of this confrontation was already tallying itself in the shadows of the hallway. By defending Serafina, Lucian had publicly challenged the High Chancellor, the man who controlled the kingdom's grain and gold. By morning, the story of the king's midnight tryst with the traitor's wife would be galloping toward every dissatisfied duke in the realm. This wasn't just a scandal, it was a blueprint for a coup d'etat. The alliances Lucian had spent 5 years bleeding for were fracturing with every minute he remained inside Blackwood Manor. His own guards looked at one another with uncertainty, wondering if they were protecting a queen or a catastrophe. If he chose to stay and see the child born, he was effectively adopting the stigma of the Vale family. He was trading his crown's security for the life of a woman who likely hated him more than the storm outside did. The punishment for such a lapse in judgment wouldn't be a fine or a stern word from the council. It would be a rebellion that would burn the capital to the ground before the child could even take its first breath. Serafina let out a jagged, involuntary cry as the pain finally broke through her wall of silence. She collapsed onto the first step of the grand staircase, her fingers clawing at the rotted wood as her water broke, staining the white nightgown. Lucian moved then, his hands catching her shoulders. But his touch was frantic, lacking the clinical coldness he had shown moments before. "The physician, where is the nearest physician?" he demanded, looking at his captain of the guard. The captain stepped forward, his face grim under his helm. "The bridge at the ravine washed out an hour ago, sire. No one is coming in or out of this cliffside tonight." Serafina looked up at Lucian, her face drenched in sweat and tears, her voice a broken rasp. "You wanted us gone. You wanted the veils forgotten. Well, look at me now, Lucian." Before he could respond, a heavy, rhythmic thudding began to vibrate through the floorboards, not from the storm, but from the cellar below. A muffled, metallic scraping followed, as if someone were dragging a heavy chain across the stone. The king drew his sword, his eyes darting to the darkness of the kitchen corridor. "I am not the only guest you have tonight, Serafina," he whispered, as a shadow detached itself from the wall at the far end of the hall. A man in a tattered naval uniform emerged from the gloom, his face half hidden by a hood, holding a crossbow aimed directly at the king's heart. "The king is right," the stranger rasped. "The veils don't go quietly, and neither do the men you left to drown." The crossbow bolt clicked into place, a sharp, mechanical sound that seemed to freeze the very air in the hallway. King Lucian did not flinch, but his grip on Serafina's shoulder tightened, his knuckles white against the dark fabric of his cloak. The guards at the door drew their steel, the rasp of blades filling the foyer, yet no one moved toward the hooded man in the shadows. A terrifying stillness settled over the room, broken only by the ragged, wet gasps of Serafina as she buckled under a fresh wave of agony. The hooded man's finger hovered over the trigger, his eyes gleaming with a manic light that suggested he had nothing left to lose. "One step closer, Majesty, and I'll ensure the veil line ends exactly where you started its destruction," the stranger hissed. Serafina's knees hit the floor again, her body twisting in a visceral, uncontrolled reaction to the contraction. She didn't look at the assassin or the king. Her world had narrowed down to the fire tearing through her midsection and the cold stone biting into her shins. The king's guards remained paralyzed, caught between their duty to protect the monarch and the impossibility of a clean shot in the dim, flickering lantern light. Every second of silence increased the suffocating weight of the standoff, making the air feel thick with the scent of ozone and impending death. Inside the chaos of her mind, Serafina felt a crushing sense of inevitability. She was a woman whose life had become a battlefield for men's egos. She realized with a sickening clarity that she was no longer a person to anyone in this room. She was either a shield, a target, or a political liability. The loss of her identity was now complete. She was simply the vessel of a dying house, a physical space where pain and politics collided. She feared that even if she survived the night, the king would only keep her alive as a prisoner to ensure the man with the crossbow never spoke. She looked at Lucian's face, searching for a trace of the man who had once been her husband's friend, but she found only the cold, hard mask of a ruler. His sudden protection felt like a secondary cage, a way to control the narrative of her suffering rather than an act of genuine mercy. The distrust she felt was a poison in her veins, making her want to crawl away from his touch, even as her body failed her. She knew that in the world of the court, kindness was always a precursor to a transaction, and she had nothing left to trade but her silence. She wondered if the assassin was right, if the best thing for her child was to never take a breath in a world where the king's cloak was as heavy as a shroud. The consequences of her survival felt more terrifying than the prospect of her death. The hooded man, the survivor of the naval massacre, let out a jagged laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "You look surprised, Lucian. Did you think the sea was better at keeping secrets than your council?" Lucian stepped forward, shielding Serafina with his own body, his sword held low but ready. "I know who you are, Silas's man, and I know who paid you to wait in this cellar for a woman who could no longer defend herself. The council wants her silenced, and they want that child gone before it can claim a seat at the table," the assassin countered, his voice rising in pitch. "You being here is an inconvenience, but a dead king and a dead widow solve everyone's problems at once." The king's expression didn't change, but his eyes tracked the slight tremor in the assassin's hand, calculating the distance and the timing of the shot. If you fire that bolt, my guards will turn you into a sieve before you can reload, and you will die for a council that will forget your name by dawn. The calculation in the room shifted as the hooded man weighed the king's words against the gold he had been promised for the widow's head. He wasn't just a killer, he was a desperate man looking for a way out of a trap that had closed around everyone in the manor. I'm not afraid of them, the assassin spat, though his aim wavered for a fraction of a second as Serafina let out a high, thin scream of pain. Lucian didn't use the moment to attack. Instead, he knelt beside her, his sword still in hand, refusing to yield the ground. The cost of this stalemate was written in the blood, now pooling on the marble floor from Serafina's labor. By refusing to retreat and leave her to the assassin, Lucian was effectively declaring war on his own cabinet of advisors. Choosing to prioritize the life of the traitor's widow over his own immediate safety was an act of political suicide that would be interpreted as madness in the capital. The lords who sat on his council would see this not as bravery, but as a betrayal of the stability he had promised the realm. Alliances with the powerful northern houses, who had profited from the seizure of the Vale lands, would vanish into smoke by sunrise. They would never support a king who protected the woman they had spent a year systematically destroying. The punishment for Lucian would be a swift and brutal vote of no confidence, or perhaps a more permanent accident on the road back to the palace. He was trading the safety of his throne for a night spent in a rotting house, acting as a midwife to a ghost. Every drop of water leaking from the ceiling felt like a second ticking away on the life of his reign. He was no longer just a king, he was a man who had chosen a side, and that side was a lost cause. Serafina's hand shot out, her fingers digging into the king's wrist with a strength born of pure desperation as another contraction convulsed her entire frame. "The lantern," she wheezed, her eyes unfocused and blown wide with terror. I can't see, Lucian, please." The king looked at his captain, his voice a sharp, clinical command that brooked no argument. "Forget the assassin for a moment. Get the lantern closer, fetch the water from the kitchen, and find clean linens, now." The hooded man snarled, raising the crossbow back to eye level. "I told you, no one moves until I get what I came for. I want the locket around her neck." Lucian stood up slowly, his eyes burning with a cold fire that made even the assassin flinch. "Then you will have to take it from my cold, dead hands, because I am the only physician she has tonight, and I am not finished with her yet." The assassin's finger tightened on the trigger, the tension in the room reaching a breaking point as a low, guttural growl echoed from the dark staircase behind the king. A second shadow emerged, larger and more brutal than the first, holding a heavy iron bar. "The council sent me to make sure he didn't miss," the second man rumbled, stepping into the light. "2 targets, 2 bolts. The storm will hide the screams, Majesty." The iron bar struck the floor with a resonance that vibrated through Serafina's very teeth, the sound a herald of the violence to come. In the wake of the second assassin's entrance, the foyer became a tomb of bated breath and shifting shadows. The king's guards did not charge. They stood in a defensive semicircle, their eyes darting between the crossbow and the heavy iron bar. Serafina lay collapsed on the stone, her breath coming in shallow, ragged chirps like a dying bird, her fingers still tangled in the hem of Lucian's cloak. The silence was a physical pressure, broken only by the crackle of a lone, dying torch on the wall. The fear in the room was no longer just about the law or the baby. It was the raw, primal terror of a slaughter in the dark. Serafina did not feel the relief of royal protection. She felt the cold, hard reality that she was the bait in a trap designed for a king. She stared at the shadow of the iron bar on the wall and realized that her death would be a mere footnote in the history of Lucian's fall. Inside the fractured landscape of her mind, Serafina felt the last threads of her noble identity snap like rotted silk. She was no longer a lady, a widow, or even a mother. She was a variable in a lethal equation, a piece of flesh that men were prepared to tear apart for a throne. The humiliation of her state, lying in her own birth fluids while assassins argued over her head, was a weight that threatened to crush her heart before the labor could finish her. She saw the way Lucian looked at the attackers, and she realized that his sudden kindness was likely just a move in a high-stakes game of chess. If he saved her, she would be his leverage against the council. If she died, he would be a martyr. She distrusted the warmth he tried to project, knowing that a king's heart is always secondary to his crown's survival. The consequences of this night would follow her child like a curse, branding the infant as the spark that ignited a civil war. She closed her eyes, wishing for the darkness of the manor to swallow her whole before the next contraction could rip another scream from her throat. She knew that whatever happened next, the Serafina who had entered this manor would never walk out of it. She was being forged into something harder, something colder, by the very man who claimed to be her shield. Lucian stepped forward, his sword tip tracing a slow, deliberate arc on the dusty floorboards. "Two of you, then," he said, his voice dropping into a register of terrifying calm that seemed to chill the air more than the storm. "Does the High Chancellor think so little of my guards that he sent only a pair of cellar rats to do his work?" The man with the iron bar spat on the floor, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "The Chancellor knows you're soft for the woman, Lucian. He knows you'll hesitate to kill us if it means she might get caught in the crossfire." Lucian's eyes flickered to the crossbowman, who was now sweating despite the cold, his aim beginning to drift toward the king's throat. "Hesitation is a luxury I discarded the day I ascended the throne," the king replied, his hand tightening on the hilt of his blade. The calculation in the room was a palpable thing, a tally of lives and deaths that favored no one. The king knew that one wrong move would end the Vale line and his own reign in a single, bloody heartbeat. "Drop the bar and the bow, and I might let you live long enough to see the sunrise from a dungeon cell," Lucian offered, though his tone suggested he hoped they would refuse. "But if you move toward the girl, I will ensure your deaths are the slowest thing to happen in this house tonight." The second assassin laughed, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the empty hallway and raised the iron bar. "We aren't here to negotiate, Majesty. We're here to collect on a debt that's been owed since the day you let this traitor's wife live." The cost of this stalemate was growing by the minute, a debt of blood and political capital that Lucian could never hope to repay. By engaging with these men instead of retreating, he was validating their claim that Serafina was a threat to the stability of the realm. Every word spoken in this hallway was a match struck near a powder keg. If the council heard that the king had personally dueled with common thugs to protect an exile, his authority would evaporate. The alliances with the southern grain lords, who demanded the Vale lands be kept in escrow, would break beyond all repair. Choosing Serafina was choosing to be a king of a broken kingdom, a ruler who preferred the company of ghosts to the loyalty of his own court. The punishment for his forbidden protection would be a reign marked by constant rebellion and the lingering scent of scandal. He was no longer just protecting a woman. He was dismantling the very foundation of his power, brick by bloody brick. The lords would never forgive him for making them look like cowards while he played the hero in a rotted manner. The risk was total, the payout was nil, and the only thing waiting for him at the end of the night was a throne made of glass. Yet, as he looked back at Serafina's trembling form, he knew he had already passed the point of no return. The crossbowman finally cracked under the pressure of Lucian's stare, his finger twitching on the trigger as a sudden bolt of lightning illuminated the hall in a blinding, white flash. The mechanical snap of the bow echoed through the foyer, the iron bolt whistling through the air with lethal intent. Lucian moved with a speed that seemed unnatural, his cloak swirling as he lunged towards Serafina, shielding her body with his own as the bolt hissed past his ear. The iron projectile buried itself deep into the rotted wood of the staircase, inches from where Serafina's head had rested a moment before. "Now," the king roared, and his guards surged forward like a wave of steel, their blades catching the flickering light of the lanterns. The second assassin swung the iron bar in a desperate arc, catching the lead guard in the chest with a sickening crunch of armor and bone. Serafina screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror as the violence exploded around her, the air suddenly thick with the scent of iron and sweat. She felt Lucian's hand on her back, his voice a frantic, low hiss in her ear. "The cellar, we have to get to the cellar. The stairs won't hold." She tried to move, but her body was a leaden weight, another contraction seizing her with a violence that made her vision go black. As the king dragged her toward the kitchen corridor, a new shadow appeared at the top of the stairs, silhouetted against the storm outside. "The bridge is gone, and the manor is surrounded," a voice called down, cold and clear as mountain water. It was the High Chancellor himself, holding a lantern that cast a long, accusing shadow over the king and the widow. "Will you come quietly, Lucian, or must we burn the house down to get to her?" The High Chancellor's voice hung in the frigid air like a guillotine blade, freezing the bloody skirmish in the foyer. The king's guards halted their advance, their swords still slick with the lifeblood of the assassins, as they looked up at the man who held the kingdom's purse strings. Serafina lay in the shadows of the corridor, her fingers clutching the damp stone of the floor as she watched the lantern light from the stairs dance across the Chancellor's face. The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of fresh blood. Lucian did not lower his sword, but his posture shifted, a subtle tensing of muscle that betrayed his growing desperation as he looked from the stairs to the dying woman at his feet. The fear in the room was no longer just about the assassins, it was the realization that the law itself had arrived to finish the job. Serafina did not feel the relief of a rescued woman. She felt like a cornered animal watching two predators decide who got the first bite. Every stare from the Chancellor's men felt like a brand, marking her as the catalyst for a kingdom's collapse. Inside the suffocating darkness of her mind, Serafina felt the last remnants of her name being erased by the sheer scale of the scandal unfolding around her. She was no longer a mother or a wife. She was the evidence, a living, breathing mistake that the Chancellor intended to bury beneath the floorboards of Blackwood Manor. The humiliation of being found in such a state, half-naked, bloodied, and in the throes of labor, was eclipsed only by the terrifying certainty of the consequences. She knew that if the king chose to save her, the Chancellor would brand him a madman and seize the throne before the sun reached its zenith. She distrusted the way Lucian stood over her, his shadow offering a protection she was certain he would retract the moment he realized the depth of the Chancellor's power. Sudden kindness from a man who had already cost her everything felt like a fresh betrayal, a way to keep her quiet until a more convenient end could be arranged. The weight of the locket against her chest felt like a hot coal, a secret that had burned a hole in her life for a year. She feared that if Lucian saw what was inside, he wouldn't save her. He would kill her himself to protect the lie he had built his reign upon. Identity was a luxury for those who weren't bleeding out on a cold floor while a king and a chancellor bartered for their soul. She closed her eyes, praying for the next contraction to take her consciousness so she wouldn't have to watch the men she hated decide her fate. The High Chancellor took a slow, deliberate step down the stairs, his eyes never leaving Lucian's face as he gestured to the surrounding guards. "You are overstepping your bounds, Lucian. The council has already voted to finalize the seizure of this estate and its inhabitants." Lucian's voice was a low, dangerous snarl that vibrated through the floor. "The council does not vote on the lives of women in labor, and they certainly do not send common thieves to assassinate a king." The Chancellor's face did not change, but his eyes narrowed with a calculation that signaled a shift in the political winds. A king who hides in the house of a traitor is a king who is no longer fit to wear the crown, and I think the lords of the North will agree when they hear of tonight's indiscretions. The threat was unspoken but absolute. The Chancellor was not here to rescue the king, but to document his downfall and ensure there were no witnesses left to tell a different story. Lucian remained calm, but the tip of his sword began to tremble almost imperceptibly as he weighed the lives of his few loyal guards against the Chancellor's small army. "If you move against me, you move against the throne," Lucian stated, though the words felt hollow in the decaying grandeur of the manor. "The law is mine to interpret, not yours to dictate in the dark." The Chancellor laughed, a dry, rattling sound that echoed through the empty hallway. "The law belongs to those who survive the night, and right now you are a man trapped in a house with a ghost and a dying lineage." The cost of this confrontation was being measured in the breaking of oaths that had held the realm together for a generation. By refusing to hand Seraphina over, Lucian was effectively dissolving the Council of Lords and inviting a civil war that would start at the manor's front door. Choosing this woman was choosing the total destruction of his political legacy and the certain execution of his most loyal allies. Alliances with the merchant guilds and the naval commanders would break the moment news reached the capital that the king had taken up arms against his own chancellor. The punishment for such a defiance was not merely exile, but the total erasure of Lucian's name from the history books. He was trading the peace of an entire nation for the life of a woman who had spent every day for a year cursing his name. Make no mistake, if he survived the night, he would be a king in name only, a ruler of ash and whispers with a target on his back that would never vanish. The scandal of the traitor's widow would be the fire that consumed everything he had ever built. In the chaos of the verbal standoff, Lucian knelt to pull Seraphina further into the shadows, and his fingers brushed against the cold metal of the locket hanging from her neck. The chain snapped as her body buckled under a fresh contraction, and the locket fell onto the floor, spring-loading open as it hit the stone. The king froze, his eyes widening as a small, tightly rolled parchment fell out, bearing a seal that only the royal inner circle possessed. He picked it up with trembling fingers, his breath hitching as he recognized the handwriting of his own late cousin, the traitor he had exiled. "It wasn't a betrayal," Lucian whispered, his voice cracking with a sudden, devastating grief as he read the words. "He wasn't selling the fleet, he was hiding it from the Chancellor's own men." The realization hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't just exiled a traitor, he had systematically destroyed his most loyal friend to cover the Chancellor's own theft. He looked up at the Chancellor, who had frozen on the stairs, the man's face finally showing a flicker of genuine, murderous panic. "Give me the paper, Lucian," the Chancellor commanded, his voice shaking as he signaled his men to draw their bows. "Give it to me, or I will ensure neither you nor that woman leaves this hallway alive." Lucian tucked the parchment into his tunic and stood, his eyes burning with a righteous, lethal fury that made the guards take a step back. "I have spent a year living a lie you fed me," the king roared, "but I will not spend another minute letting you touch her." As the Chancellor's archers leveled their bows, a heavy, rhythmic thudding began at the manor's back entrance, followed by the sound of splintering wood. A third force was breaking in, and by the roar of the voices, they weren't the king's men or the Chancellor's. "The creditors weren't just after the house," Seraphina gasped, her eyes fluttering as she clutched Lucian's hand. "They want the child. They know what he is. Lucian, don't let them take him." The back door of the manor disintegrated into a spray of rotted splinters, and the screams of the storm rushed in to fill the hallway. The Chancellor's archers pivoted toward the new threat, their arrows trembling in the knock as shadowy figures flooded the kitchen corridor. Seraphina's world was a blur of steel and strobe-like flashes of lightning that revealed a nightmare of shifting allegiances. She saw the king's guards forming a wall of shields around her, but their armor was dented, and their breath came in panicked, white plumes. Silence fell for a fraction of a second, a hollow gasp of time where the Chancellor's men and the new invaders stared at one another across the broken floorboards. The fear in the room was no longer a quiet thing. It was a screaming, physical presence that made the air feel like ice in Seraphina's lungs. She did not feel saved by the king's proximity or the arrival of more men. She felt like a prize being fought over by vultures and wolves. Her body was failing her, and she could see the way the guards looked at her bloodied gown, with a pity that felt more like a death sentence than any blade. Inside the suffocating heat of her own pain, Serafina felt the last threads of her humanity being traded for political leverage. She was no longer a duchess or even a woman. She was a claim, a piece of biological evidence that held the power to validate or destroy the king's bloodline. The loss of her identity was absolute as she watched the chancellor and the king argue over her as if she were a disputed map. She feared that if the king survived, he would only keep her alive to serve as a trophy of his mercy, a permanent reminder of her husband's supposed shame. She distrusted the way Lucian's voice softened when he looked at her, sensing that his kindness was a shield for his own crushing guilt. If he was truly a man of honor, he would have listened a year ago, but instead, he had waited until she was broken and dying to offer her a hand. The consequences of this night would be written in the blood of the child she was desperately trying to protect from the men in the hall. She knew that every second she spent under Lucian's protection was another second the Chancellor's men would spend planning her eventual accident. Identity was a ghost that haunted the corners of the rotted room, mocking her for ever believing she could find safety in a manor built on secrets. She closed her eyes against the flicker of the lanterns, wishing she could disappear into the shadows before the next wave of agony tore her apart. The Chancellor stepped down another stair, his face a mask of cold, bureaucratic fury as he gestured to the intruders in the kitchen. "So, you've called in the scum of the borderlands to help you, Lucian. Is this how a king defends his honor, by consorting with mercenaries?" Lucian stood his ground, his sword arm rigid despite the blood dripping from his sleeve, his eyes fixed on the man who had orchestrated his friend's ruin. "I called no one, Chancellor. These are the men you cheated of their wages when you sold the fleet's supplies for your own gain." The Chancellor's eyes narrowed into slits, his calculations shifting as he realized he was trapped between a vengeful king and an angry mob of his own victims. "If you think I will let you leave this house with that woman and the evidence in your tunic, you have forgotten how I attained this position." Threats were no longer whispered. They were shouted over the rising wind that whistled through the broken doors. The Chancellor signaled his men to move, a slow, closing circle of steel that ignored the mercenaries to focus entirely on the king's small, battered circle. "You can die as a hero in a ruin, or you can hand her over and return to the palace as the king who survived a tragic accident," the Chancellor offered, his voice dripping with poison. Lucian didn't even blink, his silence a more powerful declaration than any royal decree he had ever signed. The king's calm was a dangerous thing, a stillness that suggested he was already at peace with the idea of his own death. He looked at the Chancellor not as a subject, but as a man he was about to erase from the world, regardless of the cost to his own soul. The cost of this defiance was the total collapse of the royal structure that had governed the realm for 2 centuries. By standing with Serafina, Lucian was effectively declaring himself an outlaw in his own kingdom, a king without a court. Choosing her was choosing to see the royal palaces seized by his enemies and his own name stripped of its divine right. The alliances with the banking families and the high priests would break by morning, leaving him with nothing but a sword and a woman who couldn't stand. The punishment for his choice would be a lifetime of being hunted, a permanent exile from the very throne he had bled to keep. He was trading the safety of 1,000,000 subjects for the slim chance of saving one woman and an unborn child who might never know his name. Make no mistake, if the Chancellor's archers fired, there would be no trial, no history, and no justice, only a pile of bodies in a house that the forest would soon reclaim. The scandal would be buried in a shallow grave, and the kingdom would move on under a new, darker master. The king was not just risking a crown, he was risking the memory of his entire bloodline for a single night of penance. He was no longer a ruler making a decision, he was a man trying to find a way to live with himself in the morning. Serafina's eyes rolled back as her body finally gave way to the exhaustion, her head lolling against the king's chest as she slipped into an unconscious stupor. Lucian caught her, his sword clattering to the floor as he used both arms to hold her up, his face pressing against her damp, cold hair. "If you die, Seraphina, I will burn this kingdom to the ground to light your way to the next," he whispered, his voice a broken, private vow that only she was meant to hear. The Chancellor laughed, a sharp, ugly sound, and raised his hand to give the order to the archers. "A romantic sentiment, Lucian, but dead men can't hold torches," the Chancellor sneered, his hand beginning to drop. Before his arm could fall, a massive iron chandelier above the stairs groaned, its rusted chain finally snapping under the vibration of the storm. The heavy metal ring plummeted, crashing through the rotted wooden stairs and cutting the Chancellor off from his archers in a spray of stone and splinters. The dust billowed up, a thick grey cloud that blinded everyone in the foyer, turning the room into a chaotic landscape of screams and clashing steel. Lucian didn't wait for the dust to clear. He scooped Seraphina into his arms and lurched toward the dark gaping hole where the back door used to be. "The cliffs," he roared to his remaining guards. "If we can reach the sea caves, the storm will hide our trail." But as they reached the threshold, a new figure stepped into the light of the lightning, a man wearing the royal crest of the neighboring rival kingdom. "The king is leaving so soon?" the stranger asked, leveling a long, silver pistol at Lucian's head. "And he brought the prize I've been hunting for a year." The dust from the fallen chandelier had barely settled when the first grey light of dawn began to bleed through the shattered windows of Blackwood Manor. A terrifying, heavy silence descended upon the foyer, broken only by the rhythmic thud of boots on the gravel outside as a fresh battalion arrived. Seraphina lay paralyzed in Lucian's arms, her eyes fixed on the silver pistol leveled at his heart by the rival prince, Valerius. The king's own guards, bloodied and gasping, stood in a jagged line of steel, their faces pale as they realized they were now caught between a traitorous chancellor and a foreign invader. Every man in the room was a statue of murderous intent, their breath blooming in the cold morning air like ghosts. The fear was a cold, sharp blade against Seraphina's throat, making her wonder if the sunrise was meant to be the last thing she ever saw. She did not feel saved by the king's desperate grip. She felt like a tethered goat in a clearing filled with starving wolves. The arrival of the morning had not brought light, only a clearer view of the weapons pointed at her unborn child. Inside the hollow shell of her mind, Seraphina felt the last remnants of her humanity being stripped away by the clinical stares of the men surrounding her. To the Chancellor, she was a secret to be buried. To the king, she was a penance to be paid. And to Valerius, she was a political trophy to be stolen. The loss of her identity was absolute as she looked down at her mud-stained nightgown, a garment that had become a flag of her total surrender to circumstance. She realized with a sickening jolt that she was no longer a woman to them, but a strategic asset whose value was measured only by the bloodline she carried. She feared that if she survived the birth, she would spend the rest of her life in a different kind of manner, a gilded cage where her only purpose was to produce heirs for men who hated her. The sudden, fierce protection Lucian offered felt like a brand of ownership, a way to reclaim the property he had once cast into the dirt. Her distrust of his kindness was a jagged stone in her chest, reminding her that a king's mercy is often more expensive than his wrath. She knew that every soft word he whispered was a lie he told himself to justify the civil war he was about to ignite in her name. The consequences of her existence were now written in the smoke and blood of the hallway, a tally of lives that would be extinguished because she refused to die quietly. She closed her eyes, wishing she could return to the silence of the storm rather than face the judgment of the sun. Prince Valerius stepped over a pile of rubble, his silver pistol steady as he smiled with a chilling, aristocratic warmth at King Lucian. "I see the rumors were true, Lucian. You've always had a weakness for the things you're supposed to destroy." Lucian's voice was a low, guttural snarl that seemed to vibrate through Seraphina's very bones as he pulled her tighter against his chest. "You are 3 leagues past your border, Valerius, and I am not in the mood to discuss the finer points of international law with a scavenger." The rival prince laughed, a sharp, metallic sound that echoed through the rotted rafters, and gestured to the Chancellor still trapped behind the fallen chandelier. The Chancellor invited me. Actually, it seems he prefers a foreign ally to a king who loses his mind over a traitor's widow. The calculation in the room shifted instantly, the air thickening with the scent of a double betrayal that made the king's guards look at one another with a new, jagged suspicion. Lucian remained calm, but the tip of his sword began to rise, a slow and lethal motion that signaled he was done with words. "Hand over the woman and the locket, and I might let you keep your head as you walk back to your empty palace," Valerius offered, his finger tightening on the trigger. "But if you stay, I'll ensure the morning news is about the tragic death of a king and his illicit lover." Lucian didn't flinch, his eyes burning with a righteous, icy fury that made the mercenaries behind Valerius hesitate for a heartbeat. "You can have my head or you can have the girl, but you will never have both while I am still drawing breath." The cost of this standoff was the total annihilation of the peace treaty that had kept the two kingdoms from burning for a decade. By refusing to yield, Lucian was effectively inviting an invasion that would turn his borders into a graveyard before the week was out. Choosing Seraphina was choosing to be the king who sparked the Great Northern War, a ruler whose legacy would be defined by the smoke of burning villages. The alliances with the southern merchant kings would break the moment they heard that foreign steel was standing in a royal manor. The punishment for his noble stance was a crown that would forever be stained with the blood of the innocents who would die in the crossfire of his guilt. He was trading the safety of millions for the life of a woman who was currently bleeding out in his arms. Make no mistake, if he fired his weapon or swung his blade, there would be no going back to the way the world was yesterday. The scandal of the pregnant widow would become the rallying cry for every enemy he had ever made in his 5 years on the throne. He was no longer just a man protecting a friend's wife. He was a monarch burning his own kingdom to the ground to light a single candle. The risk was absolute, the cost was infinite, and the only certainty was that the world would never forgive him. Seraphina's hand shot out, her fingers digging into the king's forearm as a massive, world-ending contraction seized her, forcing a guttural scream from her throat. The sound was so raw, so filled with animalistic agony, that even Valerius's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Lucian dropped to one knee, cradling her as her body buckled, his eyes never leaving the pistol leveled at his head. "The child is coming, you fool," the king roared, his voice breaking with a desperation that silenced the room. "If you fire that gun, you kill the only bloodline that can unite our houses." Valerius hesitated, his eyes darting to the Chancellor, then back to the pregnant woman whose life was clearly hanging by a frayed thread. Before he could speak, a heavy, rhythmic thudding began at the front gates, not from men, but from the massive iron rams of the Royal Inquisition. "The church has arrived to settle the matter of the devil's spawn," a voice boomed from the driveway, accompanied by the clatter of 100 armored knights. The Inquisition had been watching from the shadows, and they were not here to save anyone. They were here to purge the sin from the manor. Lucian looked at Valerius, then at the Chancellor, his face a mask of grim, lethal resolve as he stood up. Still holding the screaming Seraphina, "The Inquisition doesn't take prisoners, and they don't care about your borders or your gold," the king whispered. "We have 3 minutes before they break the inner doors," Lucian stated, his voice a cold command to his enemies. "Either we fight them together, or we all die in this hallway, and I promise you, I will kill you both before the first knight touches her." The iron rams of the Inquisition slammed against the front gates, a rhythmic, bone-shaking thunder that vibrated through the rotted floorboards of the foyer. The sudden arrival of the church's executioners turned the standoff into a tomb of wide eyes and paralyzed limbs. Seraphina lay gasping in Lucian's shadow, her fingers clawing at the grit on the floor, as she watched the High Chancellor and Prince Valerius share a look of shared, predatory panic. The silence that followed each boom of the ram was heavier than the noise itself, a vacuum of terror where no one dared to breathe. Lucian did not look at the door. His eyes were fixed on his own guards, noticing the way their spear tips wavered toward the Inquisition's crest. The fear in the room shifted from a political dispute to a primal survival instinct, as the purge had no allies, only subjects. Serafina did not feel the warmth of sanctuary. She felt like a sacrificial lamb watching the butchers argue over the sharpness of their knives. The morning light was now a harsh, unforgiving glare that exposed every drop of blood and every tear in her ruined nightgown. Inside the fractured corridors of her mind, Serafina felt the last vestige of her humanity being bartered away for a momentary truce between monsters. She was no longer a woman in labor. She was a heresy, a biological error that the church would use to justify dismantling the king's entire lineage. The loss of her identity was final as she realized that her child's first breath would likely be inhaled in a room filled with the scent of burning incense and wet iron. She feared that if Lucian truly declared this place a sanctuary, he was merely turning her home into a target for every holy war in the continent. She distrusted the sudden, fierce possessiveness in his gaze, sensing that he was using her body as a shield against his own political obsolescence. To him, she was a chance at a legacy. To her, he was the man who had invited the Inquisition to her doorstep by being too proud to leave. The consequences of his protection were a nightmare she could barely comprehend, a future where her son would be hunted by priests and princes alike. She knew that every promise of safety he whispered was a brick in the wall of a prison he was building around her heart. Identity was a luxury for those who weren't watching their own executioners assemble in the driveway. She closed her eyes, trying to find a silent place within the agony of her contractions, far away from the clashing egos of the men who claimed to own her. The High Chancellor stepped forward, his voice a frantic, high-pitched rasp that betrayed the collapse of his composure. "You cannot declare sanctuary here, Lucian. The Inquisition has the right of blood entry. If you block them, you are excommunicated before the sun sets." Lucian's response was a slow, deliberate motion as he stepped toward his own captain of the guard and stripped the royal insignias from the man's chest. "I am not blocking them. I am removing the men who would let them in," the king stated, his voice a low, lethal hum. The captain recoiled, his hand going to his sword, but Lucian was faster, his blade's tip pressing firmly into the hollow of the man's throat. "Drop your steel, all of you, or be the first to die for a church that will burn your families to hide your failure tonight." The calculation in the room was a jagged, glass-like thing, as the king's own men weighed their sworn oaths against the terrifying power of the approaching knights. Lucian remained a pillar of icy resolve, his eyes scanning the ranks for any sign of a second betrayal. "This manor is now royal soil, and Serafina Vale is under the king's seal," Lucian roared, his voice drowning out the sound of the rams. "Any man who draws a weapon inside these walls without my command is a traitor to the crown and a target for my hand." The Chancellor looked at Valerius, hopping for a foreign intervention, but the prince had lowered his pistol. His eyes narrowed as he calculated the cost of fighting both a king and an inquisition. The power clash had reached a temporary, bloody equilibrium, but there was no victory in the king's eyes, only a grim, determined survival. The cost of this proclamation was the total severance of the king from the spiritual and social foundations of his realm. By claiming royal sanctuary over a woman accused of treason and heresy, Lucian was effectively declaring himself a god-king in a world that did not tolerate them. Choosing Serafina meant the archbishop would declare the throne vacant by noon, inviting every ambitious cousin in the kingdom to march on the capital. The alliances with the holy orders and the traditionalist lords would break like dry bone, leaving the king with no army but the ghosts in the hall. The punishment for this arrogance would be a crusade called against his own palace, a war of purification that would leave the streets flowing with the blood of his people. He was trading the peace of 1,000 years for a single night of shielding a woman who had no reason to love him. Make no mistake, by arresting his own men and defying the church, Lucian had become the very thing he once hunted, a rebel against the order of the world. The scandal of the sanctuary of the sinner would be the final nail in the coffin of his legitimacy. He was no longer a monarch ruling by divine right. He was a man holding a sword in a crumbling house, waiting for the world to break down the door. The risk was the soul of the nation, and the payout was a child born in the shadow of a curse. The front gates finally groaned and collapsed, the iron hinges snapping with a sound like a thunderclap that echoed through the valley. A phalanx of knights in white and crimson surcoats marched into the courtyard, their halberds gleaming with a cold, holy light that seemed to banish the morning mist. Lucian didn't look back. He shoved the captain of the guard toward the incoming knights and slammed the inner oak doors, sliding the heavy iron bolt into place with a definitive metallic ring. "Take her to the master suite," the king commanded his 2 remaining loyalists. "Barricade the stairs and bring every candle in the house. The dark is our only ally now." Seraphina let out a jagged, broken cry as the final stage of labor began, her body arching in a desperate, uncontrollable bid to bring the child into the world. Lucian caught her, his hands stained with her blood and the captain's sweat, and lifted her as if she weighed nothing at all. "You said you wanted us forgotten, Lucian," she wheezed, her eyes searching his for a truth he had hidden for a year. "Why are you dying for a ghost?" Lucian paused at the foot of the stairs, the sound of the Inquisition's axes beginning to bite into the inner doors behind him. "Because the ghost is the only thing in this kingdom that hasn't lied to me," he whispered, his face a mask of tragic, lethal devotion. As they reached the landing, a small, hidden door in the paneling behind them creaked open, and a withered hand reached out to grab the king's cloak. It was the Manor's old midwife, a woman Seraphina thought had fled weeks ago, her eyes wide with a terrifying prophecy. "The king cannot stay in the room," the old woman shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Seraphina's belly. "The child carries the mark of the eclipse. If a crowned head sees the birth, the mother's life is the forfeit for the throne." The iron bolt on the master suite doors groaned under the first strike of the Inquisition's silver-headed axes. Inside the room, the air was thick with the scent of metallic blood and the frantic, rhythmic wheezing of Seraphina as she fought her final battle. Lucian stood frozen by the bedside, his hand hovering inches from Seraphina's damp forehead, paralyzed by the midwife's shrieked prophecy. The guards outside the bedroom door were screaming as the first wave of white-surcoated knights breached the landing, the sounds of slaughter echoing through the rotted wood. Silence fell within the room for a heartbeat, a vacuum of terror where the only movement was the flickering of a dozen tallow candles. Seraphina's eyes were blown wide, fixed on the ceiling as if she could see the very foundations of the manor crumbling above her. She did not feel like a queen in this moment. She felt like a sacrificial altar where the king was preparing to lay down his sanity. The fear was no longer about the life of the child, but the terrifying price the universe was demanding for its first breath. Inside the white-hot core of her agony, Seraphina felt the last remnants of her past self, the girl who loved the sea, the widow who mourned a ghost, dissolve into nothingness. She was being reforged into a vessel of pure political necessity, a creature of the crown that would never know a moment of private peace again. The loss of her identity was a physical ache, a realization that her body was no longer her own, but a contested territory between the king and the church. She feared that if she survived, she would be nothing more than a living icon, a puppet queen whose every smile was a lie told to keep the Inquisition at bay. She distrusted the way Lucian looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate, holy fervor that bordered on madness. If he truly loved her, he would let her go, but instead, he was anchoring her to a throne that was already beginning to burn. The consequences of her survival were a dark shadow stretching across the future of the realm, a promise of eternal surveillance and whispered treasons. She knew that the palace she was destined for was merely a larger version of this decaying manor, with thicker walls and sharper secrets. Identity was a luxury she had traded for a heartbeat that wasn't her own, a transaction signed in blood and sealed with a king's kiss. She closed her eyes as the final contraction seized her, a wave of oblivion that promised to take her away from the screaming men and the splintering doors. The High Chancellor, bloodied but unbowed, kicked through the remains of the bedroom door just as the infant's first cry shattered the tension of the room. He stood in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the bundle in the midwife's arms, his face a mask of calculated, murderous intent. Lucian did not turn to face him. He remained on his knees by the bed, his hand finally closing over Serafina's limp fingers as her breathing slowed to a terrifyingly thin rasp. "You are too late, Chancellor," the king whispered, his voice a low, vibrating growl that made the candles flare. "I am never too late for an execution, Lucian. The Inquisition has already declared the mother a vessel of the eclipse," the Chancellor spat, gesturing to the knights crowding the hallway. The calculation in his eyes was cold and final. He would kill the mother to control the child, and kill the king to seize the regency. Threats of excommunication and death hung in the air like smoke, but Lucian simply stood up, his height dwarfing the broken doorway and the men who stood within it. He was no longer a man seeking penance. He was a monarch who had looked into the abyss and found it wanting. "If you touch her, I will not just kill you, I will erase your entire bloodline from the scrolls of this kingdom," Lucian stated, his voice a calm, lethal promise. The Chancellor hesitated, his hand hovering over his sword, as he realized the king was no longer playing by the rules of the court. The power clash had shifted from a political maneuver to a primal defense of the den, a struggle where status and law meant nothing compared to the raw will of a man with nothing left to lose. Lucian's shadow fell over the Chancellor, a dark, suffocating weight that seemed to drain the light from the room. The cost of this final stand was the absolute destruction of the king's reputation among the pious and the powerful alike. By defying the Inquisition's prophecy to save Serafina, Lucian was effectively declaring himself an enemy of the faith, a king of heretics. Choosing her meant the coronation of their son would be a ceremony of shadows, a day of mourning for the old laws and the beginning of a reign of iron. The alliances with the neighboring kingdoms would break the moment they realized the king had chosen a cursed heir over the stability of the continent. The punishment for his defiance was a life lived in a fortress, a reign where every meal was tested for poison and every guard was a potential assassin. He was trading the love of his people for the survival of a woman who might never forgive him for the blood he had shed in her name. Make no mistake, the new reign would not be one of peace, but of a long, cold war against the very institutions that had once supported the throne. The scandal of the Queen of the Eclipse would be the fire that kept the kingdom in a state of perpetual fear. He was no longer a king by divine right, but a king by the strength of his own blade, a ruler who had replaced God with his own desperate heart. The risk was the soul of the nation, and the payout was a crown made of thorns and a throne of glass. The scene shifted with the brutal finality of a closing book, the rotted wood of the manor replaced by the cold, white marble of the royal balcony. Serafina stood in the morning sun, her velvet robes heavy with the scent of lilies and the weight of 1,000 eyes watching from the plaza below. She held the child in her arms, a small, quiet weight wrapped in the gold and black silks of the Montrevel line, his eyes reflecting the cloudless sky. Beside her, Lucian stood in full regalia, his crown a jagged circle of gold that seemed to press down on his brow with a visible, crushing force. The silence from the crowd below was not one of reverence, but of a terrifying, bated breath, a fear that the prophecy of the eclipse was about to come true. Serafina looked down at the child and then at the king, her face a mask of perfect royal porcelain that hid the scars of the night at Blackwood. "The people are waiting for a sign, Lucian," she whispered, her voice a ghost of the rasp it had been in the mud. The king did not look at the crowd. He looked at the hand she had placed on the stone railing, noticing the way her fingers still trembled. "They have their sign. They have a king who lives and a queen who survived the darkness," Lucian replied, though his eyes remained fixed on the horizon where the Inquisition's banners were already gathering. A new ultimatum had been delivered to the palace gates just an hour before. The child must be tested by fire or the city would be razed. Serafina tightened her grip on the infant, her heart hammering against the ribs that still ached from the labor. The central conflict of their lives was not resolved by the crown. It was merely elevated to a height where the fall would be fatal for everyone. If Seraphina's harrowing stand against the storm and King Lucian's ultimate penance moved you, show your support by giving this video a thumbs up. Is true nobility a birthright of blood, or is it found in the rare courage to admit when you've been wrong? We want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe and hit the bell icon to ensure you never miss our next tale of high-stakes redemption and gothic romance. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that even the coldest, most royal hearts can be melted by a single, undeniable truth.